Dr. Timothy Crimmins is a professor of history and director of the Center for Neighborhood and Metropolitan Studies at Georgia State University. His research largely focuses on Atlanta's urban history. He is the co-author of Democracy Restored, A History of the Georgia State Capitol, for which he was selected the Georgia Author of the Year in History by the Georgia Writers Association. Tonight, Dr. Crimmins is going to set the stage for a brief history of Atlanta streets and their evolution from the Industrial Revolution to present day. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Timothy Crimmins.
Well, thank you very much, Kat. It's my pleasure to be here today with you all. And let me get my instruments. So my task is to get us thinking about streets and instead of this moment in time, to take us back in previous moments in time. So let's just start thinking about streets. We think of them as pathways for people, and our task today is to try to make them more accessible as pathways for people. But historically, they've been rights of way for wagons and carriages and omnibuses and trolleys and bicycles, and more recently automobiles, buses. But streets also, because they're there and they're the public, they're conduits for waste and they're places that the rain can go. Above the streets we put water, we put lighting and telegraph and electricity and telephone wires, and beneath streets we put water and sewer and gas and cable. And so streets carry all these functions. And so what I'd like to do is to take us back to a simpler time and to think of, in the pre-industrial period, how different it was. And so I'd like to take us back to one of those great minds of 18th century America, Benjamin Franklin, who in his autobiography shows you the kinds of issues that he was concerned with. And he was concerned with the foul streets of the cities that he lived in. And he was offering 18th century solutions to these, which came to his mind. And so his way of having the streets cleaned was to get old and infirm women to clean them, giving them something to do. And after laying out the plan of cleaning the streets that way, he went on to suggest a way of making them more effective in terms of self-cleaning. And so let me quote from his autobiography, where he said, "And now let me remark on the convenience of having but one gutter in such a narrow street running down its middle, instead of two, one on each side, near the footway. For where all the rain that falls on a street runs from the sides and meets in the middle, it forms a current strong enough to wash away all the mud it meets with. But when divided into two channels, it's often too weak to cleanse either, and only makes the mud it finds more fluid, so that the wheels of carriages and feet of horses throw and dash it upon the foot pavement, which is thereby rendered foul and slippery, and sometimes splash it upon those who are walking." So it gives you an idea, one, of the kinds of streets that existed in cities and the distinction between street and sidewalk, and the available technology to try to make the streets a little bit more pedestrian friendly, as well as to provide better access for the vehicles that were using them. So with this in mind, let's come and look now at Atlanta. And this is the Atlanta of today. And the point that I'm going to make is that the Atlanta of today is one that's been made, for the most part, in the past 75 years. This shows the metropolitan region of about, urbanized region of about 4.5 million people. But if we go back to 1890, this little dot in the center is the extent of Atlanta. And if we go to 1950, this oval is about the extent of Atlanta. And so you can see in 1890 a population of about 90,000, in 1950 a population of about 500,000, that the tremendous growth of the city has been in the last 75 years, and it's this growth that has been accommodated to the automobile. And so let's just go back to the beginning, and this is the Vincent map that shows the original street pattern of the city, and it shows that was published by the City Council. And so if we think about the origin of Atlanta's streets, this is the original grid. It's the Samuel Mitchell grid, and he's the one that laid out the first pattern of streets on 202 acres of land that he owned. So he set aside the streets and then divided the property around those streets into urban lots and began to sell them off. And if you take a look around the railroad tracks there, you'll see the competing grids of other property owners. And so it's the Vincent subdivision map that begins to add the north, south, east, west grid here that joins the Mitchell grid and then the other competing grids that are being set up parallel to the railroad tracks. So it's the establishment of governments, the city council, the mayor, and the creation of the city. Then the future streets are going to take the grid pattern, and that's what dominates the development of the streets through most of the rest of the 19th century. And so what's on the streets? This is an 1872 bird's eye view, and you can see it's the railroads that brought Atlanta potential of a city here. They're coming right through the heart of the city, and there's a railroad station here on the land that's been provided by Samuel Mitchell. And you have a commercial district along Whitehall Street and Peachtree Street, Marietta and Decatur Street, developing to the north and the south of the railroad tracks. And so here's an and that's the original Mitchell grid, just to orient you to the previous slide. So here's a view of Atlanta streets in 1872, the arrival of mass transit, which is a horse-drawn or mule-drawn trolley that's opening up outlying areas beyond walking distance. And this is where Peachtree and, at this point, Whitehall Street crosses the railroad tracks, and you're looking north toward 5 Points in this slide. And so if you take a look, you can see the wooden sidewalks that the building owners have put out to provide way of pedestrians to walk along the streets, and they've even provided the wooden walkways right down to the railroad tracks. But again, if you think of Benjamin Franklin and his description of the horses that are going through the street and the mud, and now, of course, all these horses, you can see that streets were a problem of keeping clean. But in the 1870s, there's also a new form of transportation that's being introduced. It's the velocipede. And here it is in the Atlanta Constitution being advertised February 5th, 1870. And this is to bring a new era. And so 13 years later, here we see in the Atlanta Medical Register a prediction. If the English velocipede is the germ of a machine destined to revolutionize the world's minor locomotion, the successful introduction of the bicycle awaits only the smoothing and consolidating of dirt roads and the streets of our country and cities. Macadamize is the motto of our times. And so if you just think of that, macadamize is the motto of our times, the movement for street paving preceded the automobile. It's really the bicycle that led the charge for what later became the Better Roads movement as a way of beginning to make the streets more accommodating to the automobile. And so here's the Atlanta footprint of 1895. These are all of the streets that run up. Oops, let me go back. And so you can see here Piedmont Park is beyond the developed area of the city. So that's the northern extent of the city in 1895. You can see the separate city of Decatur 6 miles out there to the east. And of course, all of these streets are, at this point, not yet paved. And so it was the introduction of the electric trolley that led to the paving of some streets. And so here's the good roads, folks, paving in the 1880s. And you can see the materials they're using to just basically tar the roads with gravel, simple macadam as a way of providing them a little bit smoother ride for the bicycles. But by the turn of the century, if you take a look here at 5 Points, you can see trolleys and carriages and wagons and bicycles. And I have circled the trolleys and If you haven't seen it yet, the carriages, and there's the bicycles moving along at 5 points there. And the bicycles were a dominant way of moving around the region, at least the city, at the beginning of the 20th century. And so, also you can see that at this point electric trolleys have come in. And if we just go back for a minute to think about the normal city horse and some of the problems of what the horse created, the horse produces about, I think, 20 pounds of manure and 3 gallons of urine a day. All of that left on city streets. And if you think of not just the trolleys that are moving through the streets, but all of the wagons that are moving through the streets as well. And then you get a sense of the size of the problem of cleaning the streets that Benjamin Franklin recommended that infirm elderly women occupy themselves with. And so by this time, street cleaning crews had come in that had been considered to be a city function, and these were beginning to be taken over by the city. But there were other problems as well. The 1880 census in Atlanta, in a narrative report about the city, says that one of the biggest problems that Atlanta was facing were dead, abandoned horses left on the streets. If you think of abandoned automobiles as a problem, imagine the problem of abandoned horses. And the average life of a horse was about 2 years, and so they weren't long-lived, and in many instances were just left to lie where they dropped. So horses were a major problem in American cities, and to a certain extent the electrification began to solve that problem. But there were also where to put them. People who lived brought them to cities. This is one of my favorite New York slides. Can you find the horse? So for the most part, stables were one-storied affairs, but in highly dense urban areas, they went multi-stories. And again, you can imagine just clearing out the problem of keeping this building relatively clean. You can see people are living next door as well. And so the bicycle tinkerers so the electric trolley then solved that. At least it began to remove the horse-drawn trolleys from the streets. But of course, it was the automobile that brought an end to the horseless carriage. And so it was the bicycle tinkerers that began to motorize, and here's an example of one of those. And so the automobile then began to transform the American city. And so here we are, all the different types of transit in the teens, and at this point you can see automobiles and trolleys and wagons as well as bicycles on a city street. This is in New York. So street paving began in earnest with the push for better roads for automobiles. And cities like Atlanta then began to worry about how to deal with all of the needs that they had. Of course, this meant that government had to raise money to build schools, to take care of water and waste. And you can see at the very feet of this poor city of Atlanta, that's the streets. And what to do with the streets that were becoming congested with the automobile. So the city undertook a major transportation study, because you can see the mass production of automobiles, making them affordable, which is what Henry Ford was all about, brought this kind of congestion. It was shown in this 1924 transportation study by the Beeler and Company. John Beeler in New York did the study. And he shows the automobiles on the street, another view showing automobiles and trolleys. And if you just think of how we had to transform the city, putting in stoplights and traffic signs in a way to regulate the movement of these vehicles that were far more lethal than the wagons that had preceded them. And this then is part of the remaking of the city. And so the Beeler report produced this map of the region showing the reach of the trolley lines to outlying areas. And it focused on how to transform the downtown. And the transformation of the downtown, showing Peachtree Street here, was to put a people mover underneath of it. So you could walk along and shop at stores at that level, or you could move on an airport people mover at 2 miles an hour, or move over into the faster lane at 4 or jump into the 6 mile an hour and enjoy the ride. Of course, this follows the route of MARTA under Peachtree, and this idea was not implemented. We built an interstate highway system because the federal government was interested in creating a way of getting cars and trucks as they were being developed from state to state, and the Highway Act of 1917 began to provide federal funding and required the hooking up of routes between the cities, and so you wanted to make sure when you crossed one state line and went into another, there would be a road waiting for you. But just to give you a sense of the old Dixie Highway, there's a preserved portion of it somewhere in North Florida there. So what we have done then in the course of the 20th century is seen this dramatic increase in the use of automobiles, shown in 1940, the dip during World War II of total automobile travel. But here in the post-war period, up to just 1996, you can see this exponential growth in motor vehicles. And it's this that's reshaped our American cities. We've built this interstate highway system to link cities to protect us from nuclear bombs sent by the Russians, which was the rationale for the Interstate Highway Act. And we created these multi-system exchanges, and these have reshaped our cities. Here's the Los Angeles freeway in the 1950s, the sign of the future to come in terms of the size of this expressway. It's created these large metropolitan regions seen connected by interstates. And here we look at Atlanta 1951 and the beginning of the transformation of the heart of downtown. You can look at the very northern piece there, and that's the arrival of the downtown connector into the downtown. And here we are, these roads going out to the suburbs and creating this whole new low-density environment that's been the creation of Atlanta since World War II. And your challenge, of course, is to figure out what to do with that. So we've transformed the downtown into little more than office towers and parking lots. In the outlying areas, we've created this tiered system for the automobile with expressways and arterials. The arterials are where the big box stores are located, and then these connect to neighborhoods nearby. And it's the malls surrounded by parking, and you spend your first 15 minutes of the mall looking for the spot that's closest to where you want to go in. The idea that you would park farther away and walk farther is something that, of course, you don't consider. And at the end, then, what I would like to point out is that if you look at everything on the bottom half of this line, pretty much into the beginning of the 20th century, those streets have sidewalks. These are the walking cities and the trolley cities. And since World War II, up at the top there, you see the urban form that's been generated to accommodate the automobile. And so the challenge that we have then is to make the city that we've created over the past 75 years more accommodating to other modes of transportation, for people who are going to walk, for people who are going to ride bicycles, for people who are going to even to figure out ways of making mass transit work within the system. And if we think that what we've created is really a mass transit system that accommodates the automobile, how do we create alternative systems when it's just as far more convenient to hop into a car and drive somewhere than it is to walk or take a bicycle or ride mass transit. So my task is to set up the panel. I hope I've done that. I think we're on the next slide. And I want to thank you very much for your attention.
So I'm going to introduce our panelists, starting from your left. We have here, my papers were out of order. We have Walter Brown, who is representing Green Streets Properties. He has over 25 years experience working in sustainable community development and the types of development that supports community life. Next down, we have Sally Phlox, who is the founding president and CEO of PEDS, an advocacy organization dedicated to making the Atlanta region safe, inviting, and accessible for walking. And Sally also serves on several local, regional, and state advisory committees and task forces, including the team assigned to developing and updating and implementing Georgia's Strategic Highway Safety Plan. She also served on the board of directors of America Walks, the Complete Streets National Steering Committee, and the steering committees of Safe Routes to School to National Partnership. Sally graduated from Stanford and has a doctorate in history from Yale, and also spent a year at my alma mater, Smith College. We also have Jim Durrett, who is down at the other end, the executive director of the Buckhead CID. He aims to create a more accessible and livable urban environment in Buckhead. Prior to heading up the Buckhead CID, Jim was founding executive director for the Livable Communities Coalition, a not-for-profit organization formed in 2005 to promote smart growth development in Atlanta. Prior to that, Jim served for 5 years with the Urban Land Institute, an organization dedicated to land use and real estate development issues, as the founding executive director of ULI's Atlanta District Council. We also have here with us, getting my papers here, Andrew Heath from the Georgia DOT. He's a state traffic engineer and in the Office of Traffic Operations, who holds bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering from Auburn University and a civil engineering license in Georgia. Andrew brings a well-rounded perspective on the agency's work, which he developed through several roles with the Division of Planning, his role as the executive assistant to the chief engineer in the Office of the Chief Engineer, and his current role in the Office of Traffic Operations. We also have with us Becky Katz, who is the City of Atlanta's new Chief Bicycle Officer and the first person to hold this position. She's going to be working across the city and state departments and with the public to make Atlanta safer, easier, and better by bike. Previously, she worked with the Visioning and Grants Project Manager at Park Pride, a local Atlanta nonprofit organization where she collaborated with communities to re-envision their green spaces. And we also have Janity Cityfall on the far side of the table here. She is the, am I pronouncing that right? Oh, good, okay. She is a senior regional planner with MARTA and has been with MARTA for over 25 years. She has experience in project management, transportation planning, and policy development in the U.S. and Canada. Since joining MARTA, Janity has made significant contributions to the authority, working with the MARTA board, senior management, staff from other departments, as well as other regional partners and the public to move MARTA's regional expansion program forward. She and her team are shepherding 3 expansion projects, I-20 East, Clifton Corridor, and the Georgia 400 Corridor through federal project development processes towards successful implementation. So with that, we'll start our discussion. The City of Atlanta has made a welcome change that could affect the future of our streets, hiring the new Commissioner of Planning, Tim Keene. In the interview last month with the blog ATL Urbanists, Commissioner Keene said the following: "The quality of life in our city going forward is completely dependent on the way we can remake our streets for something other than cars, for walking, for cycling. Whereas before we thought the only way to get our quality of life higher was to get the congestion down and get the cars through the intersection faster, now it's the opposite of that." Think about that. Tim is saying that the quality of life in our city's future is dependent on how we build streets. This implies that at some point we have to be future-minded in our decision-making. So I'll open this first question up to whoever wants to answer it first. What are some of the pros and cons of designing streets for current users versus designing for potential future users? A volunteer.
Hello. Thank you, Jim, for volunteering me.
what are some of the pros and cons of designing streets for current users versus designing streets for potential future users?
I have a question for the room. Does anybody know what the mode choice is currently for single occupant vehicle drivers as a percentage of the region, we'll say? It's in the 80 percentile range. So you tell me, is that? Do you guys think that that's something that we'd like to continue to see moving forward? If we continue to encourage single occupant use vehicles across the region, and with continued growth, continued economic growth that we've seen in the Sun Belt region, including cities like Atlanta and Charlotte, you take that to the end game. What is the end game there? You got somebody mentioned earlier about you got a lot of circulation with nobody moving anywhere, right? Circulation serving nobody. So I think that you've got to consider what is out there now, because you have a lot of folks that do like to drive in their vehicle by themselves, but also what you've got to do to ensure reliability in mobility. To make sure that you can keep people moving to and from jobs, keep commerce in this region, and keep the region growing.
Great. Would anyone else like to respond or add on?
I think that I think it is important to design for today and tomorrow. If all we're doing is saying, let's imagine how we're going to be getting around 20 years from now, and let's put that in place right now, then that you can have an adverse consequence, which is creating chaos. And I think that quite frankly, is what a lot of people are afraid of, as I'm thinking of a particular project that two of us are intimately involved in. So the question is, you're talking about pros and cons. There are pros and cons to both of those things, and striking the balance where you can migrate to where you need to be is the difficult chore that we have to do right here, and that's what we're working on collectively.
I spend a lot of my time looking into the future, but I can't do that unless I look at what's currently on the ground. So yeah, I agree completely with what Mr. Durrett just said in terms of you've got to have both. You've got to look at who's using the system now, and you've got to look at who's going to be using the system. And not only just from a perspective of, whether they walk, ride, bike, or drive their car, but how old are they getting? How young are they? What are their preferences? So all of those things have to be factored in as you look at the system in its current state, as well as when you're planning for the system in its future state.
I think a lot depends on location, too. I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity for diversity of transportation in the urban areas like Atlanta. And you've also got a lot more younger people in Atlanta moving into Atlanta, or people who are empty nesters or older. And so I think there's a lot more opportunity to plan for the future in a place like Atlanta than there is in the suburbs, where the land use makes it really hard.
I was amused watching or listening to some of the debate about the resurrection of the idea of a bridge across Moreland Avenue. Anybody been following that? So years ago, the DOT proposed a bridge. Long story short, that didn't get funded, but the improvements that are there now are thanks to the DOT and a safety project that I actually worked on. But I find it interesting that we get into a debate about whether it's worthwhile, cost-benefit of spending money to get people to move continuously across Moreland Avenue on Freedom Park, and people think that's an absurd idea. Why would we waste all that money? And then I just think about the modal split concept that you just mentioned. I go, I could never criticize somebody for wanting to spend 1/10% for something like something like the Beltline across Moreland Avenue. It's just sort of a false dichotomy that we found ourselves in. I'd love to move beyond that.
And I guess I'll talk because everybody else knows. I also think that where we are now is something that we tried to achieve. right? I mean, and so when we think about the pros and cons of now versus the future, I mean, in 1950s, they talked about that too. And we've accomplished a lot of what we tried to do. We tried to get people to move around in cars, and that's been very effective. But now we're realizing, you know, in this discussion that maybe that's not with the congestion and not the best way. And so we have to think about both. I mean, we both also have to think about that we have to own the fact that we are here for a reason and that we were all part of those discussions, and we know people have been part of the discussions, and so it's important to also acknowledge where we've come from. So I think the professor gave a nice overview, because we have achieved a lot of the goals that we were looking to accomplish. And so now we need to set new goals and new parameters and new priorities of what we want our cities and our suburbs and our exurbs to look like.
Great, thank you all. So the former mayor of Bogota, Enrique Peñalosa, caught the attention of many people in our country as he made a profound statement about road sharing in the 2011 film Urbanized. And speaking about dedicated bus lanes for bus rapid transit systems, he said, "The first article in every constitution states that all citizens are created equal before the law. That is not just poetry. It means, for example, that a bus with 100 passengers has a right to 100 times more road space than a car with one. It's democracy at work. You can see that public good prevails over private interest." So Janity, I want to start with you on this question as our transit representative. As we consider who owns the road or deserves greater access to it, should public transit have more priority than it currently does on roadways?
Yes.
All right, next question.
Is that the end of your question?
Yeah, elaborate.
Well, I mean, it's a challenge that we deal with in the public transit industry all the time. We don't own the streets, and we have to basically negotiate every mile or half mile that we get. So that's a huge challenge. We depend on the federal government, the state government, the local governments to give us permission to operate vehicles that, for all intents and purposes, have so many benefits in terms of connecting people to jobs, helping with air quality, helping with economic development. So I do believe, yes, that just based on the benefits that you get from transit, that it should have more priority. But unfortunately, that's just me. And I think part of the challenge we have at MARTA is helping to broker a broader understanding of just what transit can do. We live in Atlanta, where the car is king, and for the most part, it's very difficult for a lot of areas to see the value of transit investment. A lot of them are very concerned about community impacts. They're worried about safety impacts, and those are challenges that we're constantly trying to overcome. So, and not only that, we're also trying to work with our partners to get them to understand the value of transit. Working with, the GDOTs, the ARCs, and there's so many that support us, but there are those who also make it very challenging for us. I'll give you a perfect example, looking at how we share our arterials and our interstates with buses. It's a challenge. Those are challenges that we're working through with GDOT and others right now as we look at expanding our transit system. So, yeah, I'd love to see transit get more priority for many of the reasons that I've just stated, but it's a negotiation process, and it's a partnership that we have to continue to work with our stakeholders, including communities, agencies, all, to try to get the best kinds of transit investment where they're needed.
Great.
I'm on her board. She did great.
I would just say, I think the only thing I don't like about that statement is that it might infer that if you have a user group or a mode choice that is not highly represented, that they don't deserve space on the street. And I don't know that that's necessarily true, or that's what we want. I think the whole notion of complete streets and providing connectivity and options for all users is something that is desperately needed in the region and in the city, so that we can ensure that mobility that folks need, regardless of their situation and where they are. So I think I like that statement, but I want to pick on it a little bit.
Yeah, it's dangerous in some ways. How do you? It almost goes back to our last discussion about current users versus future users and how you incentivize that.
And one thing, cities are really an invention to minimize the need for travel. It's to maximize exchange without having to move around. And so when I talked before about how locations are different, that we're going to have different solutions, I think we keep that in mind. For those who've chosen to live in an urban area, we design our streets, allocate the space that enables us to access our destinations while not emphasizing mobility as much, but just access.
Thank you. You just gave me a thought. So every tour I gave of Pond City Market when we were developing that, somebody would go, aren't the streets going to get jammed? And how are we going to get around? And after thinking about that a few times, my answer became, your world, my world is going to shrink. I thought about the fact I've been here for 57 years, and we thought nothing of riding up to Chastain Park to go to school from Druid Hills in 20 minutes. I couldn't even imagine. I would rather go to New York on a plane than try to get to Chastain Park at 8 o'clock in the morning. I live in Candler Park. My world has shrunk to the point where I mostly trade within a 1 or 2 or 3 mile area now. I'm down to 5,000 miles a year on my car. Mary Ellen Dunham Jones, thank you, just got rid of her car. Give her a big round of applause, please. What we all know is it's going to get worse before it gets better to a degree, but unless you begin to go through that pain threshold and you begin to reduce source, it's a source reduction problem. We're not going to get beyond that. And so I think that's really, really important. And I love doing infill development in Atlanta, and it's a challenge because people always still want our cars and they complain about traffic. But at some point, you just got to have a joint hand, a little bit of faith, and start moving into, really shrinking your world.
I get the last word every time. It's great. And I think what you see between everybody is that our streets as public spaces are really valuable. Every foot of the street is so valuable. And that's what the debates going on are about, right? Whether it's transit or pedestrian or bicyclists, is that every foot is valuable and you have to prioritize, and it's really difficult. And it's, if you watch the debates going on, if you talk about transit in Atlanta and how we prioritize that, and looking at streetcar versus biking, and we need to continue to have discussions about how we prioritize.
Great, thank you. Next, so our next question is going to touch on something that I think is near and dear to the hearts of many, many planners. And most of us are aware that in Atlanta's history, a number of city planning tools have been used across race and income lines in a way that encourage and increase racial and income disparity. So in your work, as we're looking to design and construct more complete streets that serve all users, are there concerns that we should have about how these ideas are playing out differently or how they will play out differently among different demographics? So it's really the question about how planners should be aware of equity concerns in complete streets, and should they be prioritized in different areas over others, and why, and is that how they've been playing out or not?
I think we Something I heard at the National Walking Summit repeatedly is that our zip codes are really the predeterminant of our health and our success in life. And that when we think about complete streets, that you go to an area where there's very few people or a lot of people who don't have cars, that you need to be really prioritizing the public transit, the walking, bicycling in those areas. Not just make it a pass-through for wealthier people, but a place that really serves those people. And one of the best examples I can give about where we need to be fair, class-wise, ethnically, is Buford Highway. This is a road that was the highway into Atlanta from a rural area before we had the interstate. This is probably the most successful transit route, or at least bus route, in the region. It's also the road where more people walk as their only choice than anywhere else in the region. I may not be correct on that. Peachtree may be more. But it's very important to lower income people of different ethnicities, and yet we kept it 6 lanes wide when the sidewalks were added. It's got 24,000 cars a day, and it was kept that big so that it could be a reliever for the interstate. People who are wealthier who choose to use cars, and to me that was a big equity issue and a real mistake on the part of our planners. And so I do think the needs are really different, and we need to keep that in mind, really front and center when we're planning our systems.
Yeah, and I think, and I know this is something, Sally, you've been working on for a long time too, is we've seen the development of the city shift over time. We've seen the resurgence of the inner core, and a lot of lower income folks getting pushed out, essentially. If you're a couple miles from a grocery store, you may not think about making it there, but if you don't have a car, all of a sudden that becomes a challenge. And so we have a lot of areas in this town, Buford Highway being one very much like that. But also you get into some of the ring around 285 where that's got to be a key focus area for mobility and complete street type design. Areas that are now very much underserved because of the way they were built in the 50s and 60s.
I do have to say, sorry, as a market developer, I do want to also, though, say that it's very important that people who have choices also begin to understand that the alternatives that are becoming available in the inner city in terms of alternative transportation and mobility is incredibly important in terms of changing the mindset of the people, and eventually those folks will help support all of the other changes that have to come along. So we have to work on both sides of the equation, but I'm just amazed that if you go on the Beltline now, obviously you see people of all color, all ages, having dignity, moving in that space, and it's so different than somebody just walking on a busy, Ponce de Leon. And if you do it yourself, you will feel that lack of dignity as a human being walking in that space. If you're on the Beltline, it's a completely different feeling. We've got to increase the number of opportunities to have that kind of feeling.
So the city has recently decided to create this new bicycle chief officer, as I mentioned earlier, and we're lucky to have her here with us today. So Becky, as we start to look at biking in the area, there's been a growing narrative of trails as a bike ped priority for the region, and often comes up as the top list of priorities from the community meetings where people say this is where they feel safest and they're politically popular. And so we're starting to wonder where that leaves our streets, and does this mean that biking on the streets is less of a priority? How do you think that narrative is going to play out in your time with the city?
I didn't realize that trails were politically popular. That's great. I think, again, the importance of this position and something that we need to achieve as a city, as a state, is connectivity, a network. A bike lane is not successful unless it connects to another bike lane, unless it connects to places where people want to go, unless it connects to transit. And so trails are one way to do that. That, of course, feels the safest, because who on a bike or on foot want to interact with a person who's driving in a steel box going very fast. It's hard. And so trails are obviously wonderful, and I think the Atlanta Beltline has really helped to shape a lot of those conversations about why trails are popular, or maybe perceived as popular, although when you get down to where they get placed and how they get built, I wouldn't say is always the most popular ideas, and you see pushback both from communities and political powers. But I think it is very important that we prioritize people on foot, people on bike, on our streets, because that is how we get places.
So as a follow-up question for you, what do you think the city creating this new position says about their commitment to biking?
I would say it means they're committed. I mean, I think it's been an interesting narrative, my hiring and the position creation. It's been very, very, it's very sexy, right? Not me, the position, the title. But, sorry, I'm very blunt. I have a hard time not talking straight. But what's important is that there's a rising understanding within City Hall that this is something that we need. And not just, my favorite question so far since being hired from community members is, so you're the chief bike officer, is there going to be a chief walking officer? And that's a great question, but because biking and walking should be part of everybody in our planning department, everybody in our public works department, and in our enforcement departments. Everybody has a piece of it. And I'm there to remind them that while I can do a lot, we need everybody to be talking about this in City Hall. We need everybody to be talking about this outside of City Hall. And so I would say that, yes, it means that our city is committed to becoming more walkable, more bikeable, and more enjoyable to be getting around in our city.
And if I can add, I think that's a benefit that all of us will take from having someone like you and other advocates working together, because for us at MARTA, it's not only about the service that we put on the street, it's about how people get to the service we put on the street and what do they do afterwards. So that first and last mile piece is a very, very important piece, and is in a lot of circumstances, it's what determines whether people use transit or not. So, that's another one of the partnerships that's very critical when we look at public transit and how people use it, and accessibility and connectivity.
I want to add something too that gets back to the issue of equity. When the city completed its first comprehensive transportation plan, there wasn't a whole lot of detail on where sidewalks would go. What we had in the plan was they will go in the growth areas. Basically, that's a euphemism for saying we're not going to spend any money on sidewalks, the developers will build them. You get to the question of equity. On the south side of the city, we're not having a lot of development. The same with the west side. So in the areas where you have the most zero-car households, there are no plans whatsoever for filling those gaps for the people that really rely on that. So I think that's a big need that we have here that needs to be addressed. I also want to mention something. You mentioned mindset. I think attitude is a huge issue. When I was at the Cobb County Comprehensive Transportation Plan stakeholders meetings, during the breakout sessions, I was sitting with some people who said, we need transit for people like us. And what that meant, I thought, was we need a train to our cul-de-sac. That people are very unrealistic, thinking they won't use transit unless it's rail. What I know as somebody that uses transit a lot is what matters most is how many transfers do I have to make? And if people want to rely on rail, they're going to be making a lot of transfers if they live in a low density area.
Great, thank you. So according to the Atlanta Department of Public Works State of the City's Transportation Infrastructure and Fleet Inventory Report, $152 million are needed to eliminate the combined backlog of sidewalk and curb repair. Not only does this hinder pedestrian mobility and accessibility, but it creates a significant safety issue. So, Sal, can you tell us how has the state of our sidewalks in Atlanta deteriorated? Was it really quickly? Was it a slow deterioration? And along with that, how do sidewalks play into the idea of actual pedestrian safety as opposed to just comfort?
It happens over close. I taught at Tech, so I was used to doing it without a microphone. But they have really downgraded over the years. Many of our sidewalks are over 100 years old. Neighborhoods that have the hexagon pavers, which are only 2 feet or 2 inches thick, and a real sidewalk is 4 inches thick, they need to be replaced, and they have for decades. They've gotten worse and worse. That estimate of $152 million was back in 2010, and the Public Works Commissioner has said that the annual deterioration of the sidewalks is about $15 million. So add 5 times 15 and add $75 million. I even think that is a gross underestimate. In terms of how the city is trying to address that need, the answer is they're not. They recently, at the mayor's request, put in a substitute ordinance with regard to sidewalk policy. They were not willing to shift the financial responsibility for sidewalk repair to the city. According to the mayor's office, that would create an unfunded mandate, and that funding that mandate would cripple the city. Well, there's the Americans with Disabilities Act, which already creates a mandate. Earlier this year, Los Angeles settled for $1.4 billion. Sacramento, a decade ago, settled by agreeing that for the next 30 years, 20% of all transportation money would be going to sidewalk repair. New York City is being sued. Who knows when it will happen here, but it really may, and that could financially cripple the city.
And so along with that, we have all of this great data and reports that are coming out about how complete streets are economically, socially, sustainability-wise better than the sort of one-minded street model. And putting up a bunch of the numbers here to show you all these different reports. And, you know, there's just a dearth of information. In addition to this, there's also the information showing that some road diets can actually improve throughput with fewer lanes. But at the same time, these projects are met with a great deal of pushback oftentimes. We have one person on our panel who's very well intimate with one of the recent projects. Jim, would you like to talk about how the Peachtree Road Complete Streets project kind of pushed back against something that planners and engineers alike support?
No. This has been a fascinating opportunity to sort of dissociate oneself from what you're gathered to accomplish and observe human behavior. It's really been fascinating. It is intellectually very difficult for somebody to comprehend that if you take the size of a pipe and you shrink it, that more water can get through. And that's the way people are thinking about, a lot of people are thinking about proposals to reduce lanes if you reorganize them and change how some of those lanes are utilized. And it doesn't matter how much information you put in front of them about how it's analyzed and the principles behind the analysis, it still does not compute for a lot of people. And we're talking about the Peachtree Restriping Project. Does anybody not know that we're talking about the Peachtree Restriping Project? And so the experience of people who use that corridor and who live near that corridor is that it is a congested corridor. And so the idea that you're talking about taking a 6-lane road and turning it into a 5-lane road, or even in some places a 4-lane road, it does not compute that their life will be better. And so it's a very difficult conversation to have. And once somebody is set in that belief, and they also are of the opinion that the people who are proposing this are not to be trusted, or, you know, my tax dollars aren't being spent well, it gets really complex. So, you know, I'm not sure where I'm going with this. But
let me take up
the fact of the matter is that the way that Peachtree has been proposed to be restriped will be a better condition going forward than leaving it the same, with or without bike lanes. But it has devolved into a bicycles versus cars conversation, unfortunately. And that's why I'm glad the city of Atlanta has hired the chief bicycle officer.
Let me pick up on that a minute, if I can. I have a lot of experience with Sally looking at POST-WWII. Together we were involved in writing the LCI grant that's in place now. There's about $20 million of improvements that are coming to POST-WWII. You've already seen the bike lanes. The exact same study was done by DOT, same modeling. I never got on POST-WWII in a car before. I actually find it moving much more smoothly now. The problem is that Peachtree is surrounded by much more affluence than POST-WWII. It goes back to my point earlier. Until affluent people see the models working and find that they are enjoying an alternative means of moving about. My partner Catherine Kelly lives in Brookwood Hills. She's shocked that no one walks on her section of Peachtree Street. We've got to get past that point, and I don't mean to be focusing on affluent people, but they do tend to have more power, and we've got to get that model working quickly. And so I support anything that can be done on Peachtree Street to change and move in that direction. I've seen it work on POST-WWII.
I also just want to add that this kind of conversation happens nationwide. The conversations that are happening on Peachtree Road, oh, you must be shocked, it only happens in Atlanta, right, this pushback. But, I mean, many of you probably know that every bike lane, pedestrian sidewalks that have happened in other states, I mean, Portland, Seattle, you know, these places that we all look to as being, you know, the grown-ups in bike infrastructure and so advanced. To this day, they face the opposition because, again, our roads, every inch is valuable, and people have a hard time imagining how change is going to affect them. And when you actually look at the conversation from further out about Peachtree Road and about other projects, there's a lot of consensus, right? We want safety on our roads. We want to get where we're going, however we're going. And so there's a lot of consensus, but then when it gets down to each individual person, change is really, really hard. And it's something that we have to acknowledge when we go into these discussions, is that the perception of what the road is going to be like when the change happens has got to be in part of our understanding when we go into the conversations, and to understand that it will potentially get controversial. I mean, the 10th Street cycle track, the Peachtree Center, I mean, all of these projects, and any project that we look at in the future where it takes lanes out or parking out, it's going to become well, what about my life? But how is it going to affect me? And we need to acknowledge that. And if you're in school about planning, you don't plan in a vacuum. You know, you don't engineer in a vacuum. And these parts of the conversation, we have to become skilled at navigating them.
I think in Buckhead, there's another problem, is there's a lack of a street grid. People don't have a lot of choices. You've also got 7-acre lots. When you don't have density and you don't have connectivity, people don't have many choices. And so I think a lot of the resistance there is from people that don't have that opportunity, can't imagine themselves walking or bicycling. And that's a real challenge. That was an area annexed into the city, a suburb that became part of the city in the 1950s. And that's part of the big challenge.
There aren't that many 7-acre lots.
How big are most
for me, folks, this is all about diversifying the portfolio of transportation options. If you invest everything in one mode of transportation, guess what? You're not going to be able to retire with any money. All right? So you've got to be providing choices and options for everybody, for every reason we've talked about. You've got to be investing in transportation that everybody of every means has an opportunity to move from point A to point B. And so if you are not thinking about sidewalks as safe and inviting places for people to use to get around, if you're not thinking about where can we put the preferred routes for people on bicycles to get from home to work and back again, all you're doing is investing in the same one thing that made us what we are today, but is not going to take us into the future. And then you say, well, how do you know? Well, I just do. You've got to have choices. And to have choices, you've got to invest in them. Thank goodness that at MARTA, we're beginning to demonstrate that we can be trusted with the funds that we're given to run the system that we've got today. Maybe somebody will think, let's give them a little bit more and see if they can actually expand things. You guys ought to know something. The bus system, the routes, everything that you see out there today, day after tomorrow it's going to be different because we're retooling that to understand the context that Atlanta is right now. Because we can't just keep tweaking our bus routes and hoping that it's going to serve more people. We've got to do a lot more than tweak. And you're going to hear more about that in the real soon future.